Greetings, YouTube. Today I'll be talking about life in year one, what the world was like in first century Palestine by Scott Korb, with a useful little map on the front of what the area was like at that time, or as much as we know about it, was like at that time. Um, and I bought this because I'm a fan of history. It's one of my favorite topics, and and I'm a fan of the technology of different eras, whether it's Paleolithic all the way up through the most advanced um, technologies of today. It's CERN, stealth technologies, robotics, biotechnology, what have you. Um, and I'm also interested because this is the era when Christianity began to become formed. I mean, there's no way to discuss that era without including Christ. Even though the book is not based around Jesus Christ, there's no way to discuss that first century um, in the current era history without discussing Jesus. And so he is in here, and they talk about his some of his politics and some of his disagreements with the establishment of the Jewish faith. And um, one of the things that's always amazed me so much is the number of Christians that seem to conveniently ignore the fact that Jesus was born as a Jew into a Jewish world, lived as a Jew, and died as a Jew. That while he may have had some radical differences of opinion with the Jewish community, he was still Jewish. And maybe in a slightly different world, he just would have been a rabbi. And in fact, I have an old roommate of mine that can remember his grandfather exclaiming, "Sweet white Jesus that weren't never a Jew." Well, he was a Jew and he wasn't white. That's another piece of mythology that I wish the Christians would dissuade themselves of. He was a brown person and was a socialist for all intents and purposes, or intents and purposes, if you'd like. Uh, so this covers the area about like 4 BCE up through I think 79 CE, when Jerusalem was finally essentially sacked by the Romans and the temple was eradicated except for the one remaining bit, which is the Western Wall. Um, and it did help me have a better understanding of that era politically and religiously because you had a lot going on in there. You had divisions along religious lines, there's divisions along classism lines, there are divisions along urban and rural, there's divisions between different urban communities, like the urban communities of one city having rivals in another, very much like we have in the modern world. Very similar to city states, though it was less structured and the lines weren't quite as hard. Has and it and smaller communities tend to, as the author put it, tend to lean or focus themselves on a nearby larger city. So they would become essentially bedroom communities of larger towns and or proper cities. Even though, I mean, all of these cities were not huge by our standards, of course. I mean, my city today, and I live I think there's 125,000 people here or so, maybe a little bit more now. Would have been considered very large as compared to the cities and the towns of first century Palestine. Um, and I know I shouldn't have been surprised by this, but just having the author discuss the fact of how thoroughly Jewish this entire region was almost a revelation. Because while I kind of knew this on some level, to have someone discuss it so openly and talk about how different communities express themselves in their faiths and the different core belief systems. There were 3 main belief systems, 3 main varieties of Judaism, essentially. And there was, and then Christ comes along, Jesus comes along and essentially creates a 4th. Um, and to have someone speak about it in very direct terms was very pleasant. Now, speaking of direct terms, the author here is wonderfully conversational. This was not so much like reading a book as sitting down and having someone tell you a wonderful story or giving a great lecture, like one of the best TED Talks you could possibly imagine. And the author uses footnotes, actual footnotes, notes at the foot of the page where they belong, not in the back of the book where I am never, ever going to look them up. So, yeah, I despise that. The book I'm reading right now has that. It's just little numbers, and they're all in the back of the book, and I'm never going to look them up. Whereas if you put footnotes on the page, I will read them with relish. Now, what's interesting is that the main body of the book, as I said, is very conversational, as though someone is giving a lecture. But the footnotes are even more relaxed. It's as though he's taking an aside and kind of speaking directly to you. Not to our audience of the rest of the books. It kind of has that vibe. I guess at a lecture or a TED talk. But now he's taking you aside and go, yeah, okay, now this right here you need to know, and it's very pleasant, even though the text is a little on the small side. And in fact, one of the footnotes actually had a sub passage, which was even like a point or 2 points smaller in font. I was just like, but I was able to read it all. And some of the footnotes, I'll give you an example, are quite extensive. I mean, that's a third of the page, okay? And that's some of the passages are like that. But it's perfectly acceptable, and it's very relevant to what he's talking about. One of the aspects I enjoyed the most about the book is when he's discussing the Romans, because I find the Romans very fascinating. I have a love-hate relationship with the Roman Empire, sort of the way I have a love-hate relationship with Japanese history. They are wonderful and fascinating cultures that did horrible, horrible things. And it's hard sometimes to remember when you're looking at look at all the great things they did. Oh yeah, and they did all these really terrible things. Like he discusses the fact that at one point a Roman soldier farted at a crowd as an aside, as a humor, like lifted his little whatever they called that thing. It wasn't really a kilt, but whatever. He lifted his thing and he farted at a crowd, who then stoned the Roman soldiers, and the Romans being Romans, they then proceeded to kill almost 20,000 people, because that's how Romans were. And how there was an active guerrilla campaign in a number of different places, very disorganized. That's why one of the reasons they lost. And there was one group, the Caesari, I believe is what it calls, where essentially they were just out and out assassins, moving through crowds, pulling out knives, killing people, then slipping back into the crowds. I mean, real Assassin's Creed stuff. I found that fascinating. So I really enjoyed this book. It gave me some new insight and perspective on the early stages of, or the first century world of Jewish people, even though it was not. I mean, they've been around quite a while, and the incipient era of Christianity, the followers of Jesus, who some eventually became followers of him after he passed, or was I should say passed, but he was murdered. After he was murdered, nailed to a cross, and crying out to God, "Why did you forsake me?" And it was interesting that there were so many things that were involving impurity, and so many things they had to do to stay pure. And the stages of purity was also very fascinating to me. I apologize. I started to end the video, and then I remembered that the purity things were so interesting. Like, you had to ritually purify yourself before you did all these activities, even though it wasn't bathing or washing as when it's not involving soap. It was a ritual purification in water, very similar to how I've seen Muslim men ritually purify themselves by washing before going to pray. It doesn't involve an actual, bathing from head to toe. It's a ritual purification before you commune with God. And a lot of the Jewish peoples did that when they did all kinds of activities. And they found evidence of ritual baths all over the place. Of course, the archaeological evidence for that ends in the 70s. Funny about that. After the Romans stomped on the Jewish people until they disappeared, essentially. So if you have any interest in Palestine of the first century, I really recommend this book. And if you don't, I still think you'd enjoy it, because the author presents the information in such a wonderfully approachable, enjoyable, and accessible manner.